Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about role ethics versus virtue ethics. And not so much in terms of an objection to Stoicism or anything of that sort, but just as a matter of wrestling with a particular issue that I think comes up with thinking about role ethics as a guide to decision making. Just to set that up, there's I think a common objection to role ethics is that there's a difficulty of knowing what to do when your roles clash against one another. You've got maybe duties as an employee versus a friendship, or duties of a family member versus duties of a citizen that might come up in particular situations. And the Stoics did provide a hierarchy of roles to address that. But there's another issue that I want to wrestle with in this episode, which is this idea that some roles, like in their nature, just are opposed to virtues, the classical virtues. So that's what we'll be tackling and thinking through in this episode, and I think it'll be useful both for clarifying what's the nature of role ethics, what's the nature of virtue ethics, and then perhaps thinking through some concrete examples that might come up in your life or someone else's.
Yeah, looking forward to it. We've done an episode on Stoic role ethics, so people can listen to that if you want a kind of a foundation. But I see this episode as maybe a consequence of taking that view seriously. So you get this question, well, what does Stoicism actually tell me to do? How should I actually act and live? And the Stoics respond, well, you should look to your roles. You should look to, are you a citizen, a brother, a sister, a father, a mother? What kind of relationships has the world given you? Have you chosen for yourself? And how do you live up to those and do those excellently? And that sounds all fine and good when if you're a parent or something like this. But I mean, as we'll get into, sometimes those roles expect you to do other things. And then so that's the kind of question is like, what do you do in those cases? Yeah. I mean, we'll get into it, but I'm curious to see. I just see it as, okay, we're taking role ethics seriously. How do we resolve this little conundrum that comes up that some roles seem to be not about being a good person? They seem to be about just achieving something else, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those cases are pretty easy. There's the role of being a bank robber, or role of being a tyrant, and it's pretty easy for people to are taking role ethics seriously to dismiss that. But we'll get into some other roles that might be a little trickier to think through. So we'll format this discussion. I'll bring out the issue with a stark, ancient example, if you will, thinking about Machiavelli, a little bit more extreme, but I think brings out the issue well, and then move to some more modern type roles where we might see this issue, and then we'll be thinking through possible solutions or ways to think through this issue. Cool. Sound good to you?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So Machiavelli famously wrote The Prince, which is sort of a handbook for rulers, and it's written during a very hectic period in Italian history. And it's very controversial. I think Machiavelli, he's one of these figures, like many philosophical figures, who gets caricatured. And of course, we have this term now, Machiavellian, to sort of denote cynical, purely egoistic strategizing, which there's some truth to, but of course, like many of those terms that enter the common parlance, as it were, is also a bit of a caricature. But I think he's I was reading The Prince the other day, and I think he brings out this issue very clearly. And in particular, he sort of challenges or at least one of the classical ideals of political leadership, which sees it as consistent with virtue. The excellent ruler is the virtuous one. And he pushes back on this, and he thinks, no, there's the virtue and being a good prince, being a good political leader, are not necessarily aligned. So I think that that's the way to see this issue and clearly, where you have the role, being a good political leader, being an excellent political leader, and the thought that it's not always aligned with being virtuous. So, in particular, he argues that to some amount, cruelty can be used well if you're a political leader. Deception is necessary. And I'll just read some lines from him so you can get a sense of his view, his writing. So he's talking about acquiring new provinces. Anyone who acquires these lands and wishes to hold on to them must keep two things in mind. First, that the family line of the old prince must be wiped out. Second, that neither their laws nor their taxes be altered. And that's you could see that so sort of as this is instructions for maintaining your power through violence, which in some sense, of course, it is. But he's also concerned about political stability and longer term peace at the cost of cruelty at the moment. There's actually an ancient Roman Stoic example of this, where you have the Stoic Arius Didymus, who was an advisor to Augustus. He advised Augustus to kill one of Caesar's son, his son with Cleopatra, Caesarion, who was a young boy at the time, really following this kind of Machiavellian reasoning that it's not too good to have too many Caesars. So that's one example. I think the clearest example is this idea of cruelty as really a good-making property of a political leader. On that line, he says, those cruelties are well used if it is permitted to speak well of evil, that are carried out in a single stroke, done out of necessity to protect oneself, and then are not continued, but are instead converted into the greatest possible benefits for the subjects. Those cruelties are badly used that, although few at the outset, increase with the passing of time instead of disappearing. So that's an interesting line. Machiavelli has this heuristic about if you're going to be cruel, if you're going to be violent, if you're going to dole out punishment, if it were to your enemies, you should do it extremely all at once. Sort of an interesting strategic idea. But more importantly for our purposes here, if you think about, what's the function of a ruler to create a polity that lasts, and he even mentions here, do things that benefit your subjects. Well, that is, on his view, different from being virtuous. So I wanted to start with this example first because it's what prompted me thinking about this issue, and also just because it's even if maybe it doesn't resonate right away because of the different circumstances Machiavelli found himself in, the people he's advising found themselves in, it does, in a philosophical sense, bring out the issue really nicely. Machiavelli's challenging this idea that an excellent political leader is virtuous in the classical sense. So do you have any quick reactions to that?
Yeah. Do you, I haven't actually read The Prince. Do you read that as being literal? Like I think I remember some people talking about maybe it's like a satire or like a veiled criticism. Do you read Machiavelli as being literal? Just out of curiosity, it doesn't
Yeah,
change the argument.
it's hard to say. Maybe it's a little bit easier to dive into particular points. I think there's certainly some cases where you might need to read in between the lines with Machiavelli. He's one of those types of thinkers. But in general, I would say, yeah, I would read him literally here. But some of the quick readings people have about him being, say, completely opposed to virtue, ends justify the means, this sort of thing is a mistake. And it's also noteworthy that he did write something else called the Discourses, which is about discourses on Livy, the Roman historian Livy, which is about how to run a good republic, which is interesting in this conversation because in that book, he sounds a lot more friendly to modern ears. He's not talking about wiping out your enemy families and so on. And that's, I think, because he does have this view that if you're a prince, then that means the circumstances are quite different from living in a republic and being a citizen of a republic or trying to create a republic. So yeah, maybe that's a little bit of an indirect answer to the question, but he's an interesting thinker in general. I would lean literal, but you do need to take the whole picture of Machiavelli. And he is clear that in The
Yeah.
Prince, he's just talking about this specific situation, and it's not a grand theory of, anyone ought to become, live like this, a kind of egoistic.
Mm-hmm.
These days, we'd say Machiavellian type picture. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand the tension. I think you'll have some answers to it later on or some potential resolutions, but I think you did a good job laying out the tension. I'm a little bit curious why there's this type difference with the bank robber. Because, you're the start, you're a bit dismissive of, the bank robber or the serial killer. It really does just seem to me this idea that, to be good at doing certain things, there's all these different kinds of roles we can take on, or pursuits, or crafts, I think, as the Stoics might say. And, Stoicism is the craft of living holistically. But if you take on this craft of being a prince, well, pursuing at that craft is not the same as being a good person. They have different ends. And yeah, so then attention arises, but it seems to me like that's the way that I'm thinking about it, is just like some crafts. I think about this in terms of like, fighting or business. I'm sure we're going to go through examples. There's just sometimes characteristics where it's like, oh, it would be better to not be empathetic, for example, or it would be better to be a little bit more aggressive or vicious. If I was building somebody in a system, if I was maybe hiring somebody into this role, I wouldn't necessarily select for the best person. I'm not selecting for the best person. I'm selecting for the best prince or the best fighter or the best, CEO.
mm-hmm.
And those are just different crafts. The same way, running is a different craft than carpentry, and so on and so forth. I mean, the Stoics might have some sort of answer here about, living well is the ultimate craft, and so everything is like contained under it. But that seems to me to only just to be an argument for why we should pursue that craft. Yeah, these are just other ones. That's what I see the tension to be. And then if you're not fully bought into Stoicism and you have this craft or philosophy yet, and you've got this other craft, and then there's this tension about, well, do I abandon it? Do I not become a good prince? Do I become a good prince and forsake philosophy? Is there a way to be a good prince and a good philosopher? That maybe those are the questions that come out. But yeah, I see the tension really clearly. That was a good example.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you're pointing at different ways to solve the tension, and it's really
I'm excited.
it's like I suppose it's a conflict between how we initially see a given role, or a conflict between how we see a role and our initial conception of virtue. And to resolve that conflict, we could do two things, I suppose. We could say, in this case, Machiavellian political leadership just is unjust. On reflection, that's just sort of the solution. And that way we just sort of bucket it into the, it's being a prince, being a bank robber, what have you. Those are just bad roles, essentially, not roles we should take up, not crafts we should practice. But the other solution is that I think is on the table, especially as we start talking about some of these other modern examples, is that our initial conception of justice might just be mistaken. And I suppose that's the that I think that's what's worth wrestling with in these questions.
Yeah, and then I guess there's maybe a third approach. I mean, we'll get into it. I know you've got some notes, but there's maybe a third approach, which is that, I've kind of framed it as the craft of a prince is in conflict with the craft of being a good person, but maybe just Machiavelli's portrayal of a prince. I'm sure the tyrant says, every tyrant goes, well, this is what you need to rule well. And then Marcus Aurelius comes up and goes, no, you can actually rule differently. And so maybe there's this kind of false dichotomy created if you limit your conception of what's possible in that rule. But yeah, let's keep going.
Cool. So that's a classic example, I suppose, to set up the issue. Some modern ones I can think through. I'm curious if you thought of some other ones as well, Michael. But I think some modern examples where this might come up is, and there's a nice tie to Machiavelli here, is with political activism. So if you're an activist seeking to obtain a political goal, perhaps doing so might be in conflict with ordinary virtues of justice, like, we've talked about, we have this episode on the subcomponents of justice: kindness, fair dealing, good fellowship. If you really want to get something done uh, in a state, then maybe you're not going to mind using tools of deception. Cruelty is not going to look like it did in Machiavelli's day, but you might be happy to make someone a scapegoat, go after them if that's what riles people up on your side, and perhaps you even have a just cause you're fighting for, and doing so is effective. So that's one case. And in defense of this sort of case, it's easier to think about an activist who's pursuing a cause you in fact think is just, but perhaps the means for doing so can be corrupting, or they seem to violate these subcomponents of justice. We also see it in the workplace. There's this idea of, if you're a boss, a founder, or a manager, how important is it to drive these company goals, these marketplace goals, versus relationships with employees, relationships with competitors, ideas of a corporate takeover, firing employees for market efficiency, these sorts of circumstances. And then finally, another interesting case perhaps is just this case of some roles might require sort of pure impartial observation. So there's classic examples of journalists or photographers who their role is to photograph a tragedy without intervening, without interfering. Whether it's taking photographs of a starving child without feeding them, or perhaps even in some nature documentaries, recording a dying animal and not helping with their suffering. And some philosophers have also argued this is what philosophy should be like. They reject that idea that philosophers should change the world, not just describe it. They hold the role of a philosopher is to describe the world, to describe reality as it is, without adding these elements of political activism to philosophy itself. So I think that's an interesting case, contrast with the activist role I mentioned earlier. But yeah, so these are a few where you have these ideas of roles: activists pursuing a just cause, let's just to say capable boss, if you will, doing their part to obtain their market goals, and impartial observer. So all of those maybe can be excellent in some respects, but come at the cost of or come at the apparently come into conflict with some norms of justice. And in that way, role ethics in some of these modern cases seems to, if you think the description of these roles is accurate, can come into conflict with how we normally see virtue.
Yeah, I think these are good examples. I think that it works best because you can imagine anybody just being bad, right? You can imagine a teacher being a bad teacher, a boss being a bad boss, and that's not really a conflict. It's just somebody kind of being bad at what they do. So I think the example works best when you think when it seems to both of us that the best version of this person has to do unstoic things or unvirtuous things to be the best version of that thing. I think the activist that maybe applies, at least under one conception, the kind of more pragmatic activist.
Mm-hmm.
Same with the boss under one conception. Like certainly if people view it as like maximizing shareholder value or profit, which I think many bosses function under this. I think many CEOs certainly do, where they view the best version of themselves as being something that is just, it's not a question of human excellence. It's not a question of individual excellence. It's a question of like fulfilling this role or this piece within a broader company, which, just like any other, almost view themselves as like a tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the tool has a certain point, and if you're not going to do it, we'll replace it with another tool. I was also thinking about this in terms of like another example I was thinking of was soldiers or police officers, people who you think, people might disagree with this, but maybe the best version of the soldier is one who follows orders. Maybe the best version of the police officer is the one who kind of enacts the law as it's currently written and doesn't question if that law is just, or doesn't question really, their position in society or whether they're contributing to the good or the bad. It's like, I'm here basically to act as an agent of either military leadership or, the state. And I'm being a bad police officer, I'm being a bad soldier if I start inserting myself and questions of my personal development and questions
Hmm.
of my personal value into these things. So that's another example that comes to mind. Somebody's like, your function is to enact these orders, and you can practice your discretion, your virtue, your excellence within how you choose to enact them, right? Like the soldier practices courage in enacting the orders. They practice wisdom in making the decisions to enact the order, but not that kind of questioning. And so, yeah, so those are the other examples that come to my mind.
Yeah, those are good cases. I suppose you can also think in the legal context, being a good
Yeah.
judge or lawyer.
Defense, like
Yeah,
the defense
yeah,
attorneys
exactly.
defending the guilty people.
And there's another case that I neglected to write down, I suppose, which is the artist as well. We've talked about this a little bit, where perhaps in pursuit of their craft, obsession, especially think about great artists, they fall short in other roles. So sometimes it's difficult to capture this problem correctly because you can think about the great artists. They're not. It's not really a conflict between them and justice. They've just decided to become obsessed with their craft and are not taking up the mantle of being a good parent, being a good citizen, what have you. But maybe there are also cases where if you just think about what it is to be a good artist, that involves just as a matter of your attention, your focus, not spending as much time on being a balanced person, and that does perhaps come at some costs of virtues of moderation or again some amount of sociability. So perhaps that's another case.
Yeah, I do think you raised a good example, though. I mean, I think it's a good case, but I think that's an interesting guardrail as well. So I introduced the one we want stuff where we think of the best person being in conflict, and then, like I said, you don't want to just think of just because artists can be bad people. That's not the same thing. They're just focusing on one craft and they're neglecting the craft of being a person. But that we're interested in cases where it seems like you cannot be a good person, or at least you can't be a good person. You can't exercise the Stoic virtues holistically and still be excellent in that craft. It's like where they seem you can't both be the prince pragmatically torturing and hanging people from crosses to instill fear in the community and a Stoic. Or maybe you can, and we'll get to that argument, but we want to look for where they seem to be necessarily at conflict.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good reminder. I suppose what's common to all of these is there's some overarching purpose to the role,
Yeah, that's just
and
different.
it's just different from achieving one of these cardinal virtues or any other virtue. And you do want to think about someone who's not using that idea of being a good boss in order to be an asshole or what have you. No, someone who's actually doing their best. And there's a
Yeah.
question when it comes
And
to.
so
Go ahead.
I was thinking, Aristotle makes this argument in the Nicomachean Ethics that if you ask anybody why they're doing something long enough, they get down to this answer of like, well, because I think that's what a good life is, or because I think is what will make me happy. And this is one of those objections to that argument, is that maybe there's some people who just go, oh, because I want to make great paintings. And it's like, why? Because you think it would make you happy? Oh no, I'm miserable. Because you think it's like the best life to live? I don't really care about those kinds of questions. Like I'm aiming at being a great artist, or I'm aiming at being a great prince, or, I don't care about me being happy. I don't care about me making a good life. I want to do my activism and achieve this political goal.
Hmm.
And so one question I guess we need to explore is, are these roles just people who have decided not to live eudaimonistically, right? Like what the Stoics would say is that everybody's aiming at happiness and some people are making mistakes. Oh, you think you'll be happy if you become a lawyer, but and just like focus on becoming the best prosecutor you can be, but that's actually not the route to happiness. But then there's this kind of counter argument about like, no, I'm not aiming at happiness. I'm playing a different game. I have this kind of different ends. And the Stoics or any sort of ancient Greek philosophy is not going to have much to say to that, I don't think, because they're playing a different game other than like, you're making a mistake. I think that's a worse game to play. But I think that it's an interesting thought how we're constantly in that framework of like, okay, everybody's aiming at happiness. So what now? But yeah, I don't know. Is the CEO aiming at happiness? Does the CEO of a big company think this is like the best way to live? Maybe, maybe not. But if they don't, what grounds do you have to argue against that if they're not playing the game, basically?
Yeah. That's a great point. The Stoic move there is to just say, you're playing the wrong game if that's all you care about, and and they have their arguments for thinking that. And but perhaps there's also just this idea that if you're thinking of, if you are tempted, if you're interested in virtue to begin with and maybe seeing some conflict arising here, then this tension is going to be a little bit more, is going to be more live for you.
Yeah. Okay.
If you
Yeah.
want to,
Yeah.
if you want to, I don't know what the goal is, be excellent in your craft, work in a good company, you're noticing these tensions arising, then and you do care about virtue, then it's just a question, okay, did I make a mistake in choosing my craft or in how I've formulated my craft, or do I need to change how I think about justice here? And that's a broad issue, and I think we'll touch on some possible strategies there. But I do think that's a different case from someone who's just like, no, I want to be a great artist, and I don't care about virtue, I don't care about happiness.
Yeah. The question is, so to refine the question a little bit, maybe it was at the start defined this way, and it's just refining in my head. It's like, what does the Stoic do, or somebody who's at least interested in the project of ancient philosophy, or even more broadly, interested in the project of living well and flourishing and being happy? What does that person do when they've received these instructions from the Stoic to follow your rules, and then some of these rules seem to come in conflict with that target?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So I think there are three possible. There are more than three, but there are at least three. Uh, there, there are three things we can appeal to help think through these issues. Of course, they're going to be different depending on the rules, depending on the circumstances. But I think these are going to be three perhaps useful places to turn. One is just returning to the hierarchy of roles. According to the Stoics, they thought some roles are more important than others, and that might determine how we formulate our roles, our craft. And the other is to think about the subcomponents of virtue, and perhaps that changes how we think about virtues as a whole. And then the last one is to actually appeal to other ethical systems for guidance, and perhaps that'll be useful as well. So let's start with the hierarchy of roles. For Epictetus, he had about there. You can think of about 4 different levels of the roles we have, and this is useful for both construing what the roles are and then particular ones we might have as individuals. So there's our role as a human. That's sort of that universal idea as a rational being. That's something we ought to follow. And then there's roles we have that are a matter of our, what I've written down is just personality, but really capabilities. You can't be a wrestler if you're not physically capable of being a wrestler, and so on. And then there are roles we have in virtue of our relationships. These are both chosen and unchosen relationships. And then last, they're just things we choose to take voluntarily. And those are done in order, right? So if you're thinking about choosing a role, choosing to rob a bank, what have you, that comes in conflict with, at the very least, the human roles, perhaps with the relationships as well. Cool. Do you want to add any details to that quick blurb on the hierarchy?
No, I think that's right. So the robbing a bank example goes against your human role because the human role has some content to it, general content, but content about being kind of pro-social. It goes against your relationships if you like, I don't know, if your parents also work at the bank and you're like not being nice to them. It goes against your choice if you are an employee at the bank and you've kind of taken on this responsibility. You chose to do it. Nobody made you work at the bank. And then you're like, I'm going to rob this bank. Then you're kind of like, you're betraying that role. And I think in terms of your personality, maybe there's some sort of like I don't know, disposition or character. Personality and capability is just this idea that we should look out for roles that kind of suit, basically this idea that we have some natural inclinations and dispositions, and we
Mhm.
should look out for roles that suit those. Some people just like doing kinds of things. People just like to want to work with kids. Some people like numbers. Sometimes we're good at certain things. We just happen to be the best hockey player growing up in our small Canadian town or something. And it's basically highlighting those as like almost these God-given capabilities to pursue and like talent to actualize. And so maybe there, I don't know, maybe you're really good at building things and you use that to build bombs to rob this bank. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's this kind of, this kind of perversion of a capability that you have, a talent that you have that you're using the wrong way.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps one of the most useful things to do here is thinking about impersonal. There, well, I suppose going through these, what can we take from these roles that might be useful in resolving these apparent conflicts between role and virtue. So the first one again, that's the role we have in virtue of being human. I think the classical Stoic argument against Machiavelli would be that Machiavelli's picture of political leadership clashes with this. And for the Stoics, they saw, what's the content of being human? What does that actually mean? It means acting rationally, acting sociably, working together. We're meant to live together. And they also thought that it required uh, elimination of the passions and perhaps also trustworthiness. I know in Brian Johnson's book on Stoic moral ethics, he mentions trustworthiness, which I think aligns with the pursuit of knowledge, the human rationality that's aimed at knowledge, aimed at true belief, in order to, so if we have knowledge, then we can make good decisions.
I also think this is the role. I agree with all that. That's some of the content to being human. I also think it's the role that is that craft of living well. It's like the role that gives us that eudaimonistic ends. It's like if because when we're not going to focus on that example too much, but I think what the Stoic would say to the artist who's like, I don't care about being happy, I just want to make great art, is like, wow, that's somebody who's like missed the human role and gone straight to the personality role or like the disposition role. And it's like you have this talent, this interest in art, but you're pursuing that at the expense of this human aspect of yourself that you share with everybody else. And the human aspect, the end of that craft is always the end of that role. The purpose of that role is flourishing,
Mhm.
happiness, human excellence. And so that's the kind of objection to that people who aren't playing the game, the argument we were talking about before. And so I think that's an important part of that role.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, do you think focusing on this role can help address some of the other apparent conflicts we have between these other roles I mentioned about political activist, being a boss, being an impartial observer? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think the tension doesn't resolve itself because all that person would have to say is like, look, I want to be happy. I want to live a good life. But I think living a good life involves being really, really excellent at this, or it involves committing to this. This is not a something being a parent. Like there's some roles that you just you don't drop, right? Like you commit to being a parent. Maybe if you start a company, you commit to being a boss. Maybe if you become Prince, you see yourself as like, I've committed to this role and I'm not just going to give it up to um, because it makes me uncomfortable because there's some conflicts. It involves hard choices, and so yeah, I guess if I was that person feeling that conflict, I'd feel like the human thing isn't, because the Stoics don't want us to just be formless humans. They want us to
Mhm.
take on these roles and be people like Marcus Aurelius who have responsibility in the world. So I think we want to be careful not to read the human role as like being so powerful and content heavy that it just means we don't take on anything else with the risk of it being in conflict. It's like that excludes some things like serial killer, bank robber, like we talked about before. The human rule does exclude that. There's just too strong of a conflict. But if I'm being a prince who's trying to like make my community happy, right? Even if that means having to kill some people. If I'm an activist who's trying to improve the world, even if that means doing some terrorism or something like this, then I could see people not necessarily seeing that in conflict with the human role. Like they're still fighting for pro-social. It's just doing it in more of like a utilitarian way than kind of a rule-based way.
Right, right. Yeah, that all that makes sense to me. It's also perhaps there's some way in which looking at these other roles of personality relationships can bring out the conflict more rather than easing it, especially if you feel like you've made commitments. That's probably where the tricky cases arise, where difficult business decisions, you have made commitments to investors, other employees, your family, but perhaps these are all.
Yeah. I was just watching Troy, which is a retelling of the Iliad, and that's an interesting example of like at least the movie. I haven't read the Iliad in a while, but it's basically like Paris is doing all these terrible things. He steals Helen, who's like the queen of Sparta, away, and he basically brings her back to Troy, and it's they're just like, man, that was so dumb of you, Paris. That was such a dumb thing to do. But now we're going to fight this entire war and risk, everybody's lives because you're my brother if you're Hector, or you're my son if you're the king of Troy. They do that for Paris, and that's like, it would be kind of cheap to say like, oh, being a great brother or being a great father is like somehow betraying your human role. It kind of like, yeah, those tensions do arise because that almost seems like such a human thing to do. We don't look at Hector and say, oh, you're inhuman for loving your brother so much you're willing to go to war for him.
Mhm.
So yeah, you're right. I think that's where those kind of messy examples come up.
Right, right. So I think this can be used. Looking at the hierarchy of roles can be useful in resolving some of these tensions, but sometimes it does feel like either you end up in places where maybe your roles seem like they start conflicting, or sometimes the uh, the content you have on these more important roles just isn't substantive enough to help one make the decision, especially, this idea that human, that's the fundamental role. It does have content to it. I don't want to say that it's empty or anything of this sort, but when you're thinking about, sociability, what does that look like in the case of the activist who is pursuing a just cause, is doing it well, and knows that, the effective movement, forming an effective movement involves propaganda, involves scapegoating people, maybe sweeping some inconvenient facts under the rug or something of this sort. And maybe that's, they still feel the tension between those acts not being kind, not aligning with justice, but also the confidence that they're pursuing a just cause. I don't think it's it's not going to reasoning at this level. I don't think is always going to be sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, looking at the hierarchy, I think that's it. The hierarchy is helpful for some of the outlier cases, but not helpful for the more complicated cases.
Mm-hmm. I also find some usefulness in some of these other strategies. So one is looking at the subcomponents of the virtues. The Stoics had their own list of subcomponents. They often were wrestling with justice, but they also thought about subcomponents of moderation, courage, and wisdom or prudence. And the subcomponents to virtue were piety, kindness, good fellowship, and fair dealing. And I think if you narrow down on these some more, perhaps you can make some get some mileage out of them. You think about particular kindness, formulating a disposition to do good, just that inclination to do good, sort of personal disposition. I think checking in when these conflicts arise, it can sometimes be useful to check in what your motivations are. I think that's always key, or what's motivating the action, and are you really the person who's trying to be excellent in their role, or are these tensions arising perhaps as a matter of rationalizing acts for less than virtuous purposes? Perhaps that can be useful. And I think also thinking about fair dealing, um, that's a knowledge of how to deal with others' neighbors without incurring blame was the way Aristodemus put it. But I think more broadly, it's thinking about the circumstances one is in and what are the rules of fairness. And that's going to be different depending on the political dimension. If it's a politics, is it the marketplace, is it a relationship? The Stoics had different views about those, and perhaps that can guide what it is to be just.
So for this one, is it one counter argument that I was thinking of, and I just want to test Caleb if this is what you're saying, is there's this view, the Stoic might respond to Machiavelli and be like, you're just kind of being lazy. Like, you can be a great prince and not do these awful things. You justify them as kind of pragmatism or realism, but really you're just not that good. And to use a simpler example, I think of like a coach. He's a coach of high school sports. And that coach might scream at their kids, might scream at their students. And they can justify the screaming and saying, well, I'm being a coach. I'm trying to motivate them. I'm trying to get them to be as good at their sport as possible. And the more experienced coach says, well, you're just kind of a bad coach. If you were a better coach, you could achieve that result without screaming and yelling. And so is this the argument you're making, which is kind of like, you've got these subcomponents of kindness, good fellowship, fair dealing, and the good prince would figure out how to achieve the result through these, the good, and it's just the weaker, the worse prince that doesn't need to or isn't able to, basically. Is that the same thing, or how do these subcomponents help?
Well, I think they can help perhaps steer between how we're formulating the rules versus how we traditionally think of the virtue. In some cases, what you say is correct. If you're truly committed to kindness, then you could figure out how to be just in your role of being whatever it happens to be. I think that's one move. So you might fall on that side of the horn, as it were. But I think some of these other subcomponents might change how you were thinking of justice. So if you take fair dealing in particular, there might be cases where in politics, is it virtuous to take a bribe or something like this? I think the situation depends on whether you're in a country in a time where taking bribes is normal behavior, or is it something unusual that's violating the norms of politics, if you will. And in that case, perhaps maybe you should change your picture of justice. So if you think about what it is to be a good political leader, well, it depends on the time, the circumstances, what's required to actually create a stable, or what are the actions of everyone involved. I think that's and that might push you to changing your picture of what the virtues were.
So I was misunderstanding the argument entirely. I was trying to say something like, look, really dig into, really understand virtue, and then try to figure out how to achieve that role while maintaining these things, which are clearly good things. And you're trying to say, when you break apart virtue into its more nuanced concepts, there is a way to actually resolve not all of these tensions, but at least some of these tensions, where we start to see the prince's action as just. We start to see if I give the idea of the soldier or the police officer from before, maybe in a certain society that falls under fair dealing. Like, look, you're doing your job, you're going out and you're enforcing the rules, which we, are all agreeing to live by. And so that's just. And even in some cases, that's not the perfect law. It's not really your job to decide the law. It's your job, like that attorney example, it's your job to execute it. And that's fair game according to fair dealing. When we break down these ideas in more nuance, it resolves some of these tensions because we get this more expansive view of justice than just like Mr. Goody Two Shoes, perfect person kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly right. It's
Okay, cool.
well, I think what you said is it's important to understand the virtue, dive into its subcomponents, and that can either build your confidence that the way you've construed your craft is a mistake, or perhaps provide avenues for rejecting a common sense notion of the craft, perhaps. And maybe it's I don't want to say the prince Machiavelli's prince is acting justly. Though that's a possibility in some circumstances, but perhaps there's a cleaner example of this is a lawyer in a legal system, defending someone who they're fairly confident but not entirely certain is guilty. They might realize, what does fair dealing involve? What does being just here involve? It involves a broader commitment to the justice system where, that despite being imperfect is, you know, works better if, I play the role of defending this person, even if I think they're most likely guilty or something of this sort. Then it works better if people in my situation do that instead of, deciding for every case they support, taking it on their own discretion or something like that, of that sort. And, that's something that's perhaps can be one way to think about these issues.
Yeah. Well, I think those two probably realistically, like moving from a philosophical example to practical advice for people, people who are listening and they're struggling with this. I think those first two probably capture most of this. Is like, one, if you're feeling a tension because you're giving your life up to something that's not, that like actually conflicts with the goal of living well, then the Stoics are going to say that's, you're making a mistake, you're betraying your human role, and you're going to feel a tension. You're going to be unhappy because that's kind of the
Mm-hmm.
trade you're making. And then the second thing is like, the second view is like, well, if you're actually just kind of feeling conflicted on a day to day, I'm assuming most people aren't princes. Most people aren't the kind of, you know, activists who are contributing to propaganda. You more are kind of encountering complexities in your normal jobs about like, how do I feel about doing this? I think that then that subcomponent does a lot of thing, which is does a lot of work, which is, don't think of justice as this kind of amorphous thing. Break it down to these ideas of, are you being kind? Are you showing good fellowship? Partnership with other people? Are you treating other people fairly? And then think carefully about what those mean and either expand those definitions to include the work you're doing and reconceptualize it and don't be guilty about it, because it's basically saying that the Stoic doesn't have to be idealistic or perfect in some sort of like non-practical way. But then even with the practical lens on, if you still feel guilty about what you're doing, okay, then there's probably an issue. And you should probably resolve that issue maybe by changing your role.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well put. So the last thing to think about for these issues that can be useful is thinking about is perhaps cheating, but turning to other ethical theories, thinking about consequences, thinking about rights. Sometimes people talk about rights as side constraints. What's something that constrains my actions, or something I shouldn't do, and that's things that violate rights. Violating the right to life or something of this sort. And I think those you can. I think at a practical level, it can be useful to think about those kinds of things as you construe what a craft is. And this is something that's going to appeal to a lot of people who just want to reject, say, Machiavelli's picture of the political leader. Why is that no good? Because he doesn't care about rights at all. Alternatively, maybe there's some ways of thinking about, what are the consequences you're trying to promote without just being a pure, not arguing for utilitarianism, this idea that you should just care about the consequences, but at least that's part of what it is to, play a role well, is to, do what's realistically expected to achieve some consequences. And perhaps that's useful. So that's a broad level, but I think thinking about roles as, even if I take up this role, what's something that I would take to be a side constraint to it, or, what's the purpose of this role? Machiavelli sounds silly if it's just to promote, some individual's glory, but it perhaps sounds less silly if it's about, what's required to create a stable, peaceful city state in, at this period in Italian history.
Yeah, I think it's an important reminder to keep in mind what is the craft targeting? I think about that in terms of the reserve clause. Like the reserve clause in Stoicism, one way to look at it is an ability to kind of move fluidly between roles. So Epictetus is like, I will go to the bathhouse and I will try to have a fun time at the bathhouse insofar as it doesn't make me angry or, ticks me off when people are splashing or being rude. And it's this kind of view of like, I'm going to take on this role of, person going to the amusement park, but I'm not going to let it affect that role of like calm, cool, collected person. And I mean, I'm going a bit out there, but I think that the jumping back to this example was when you're taking on a role, there's a descriptive role and then there's the kind of purpose of the craft, right? So as you said, you're prince, but what is the craft aiming at? And if it's aiming at the well-being of other people, then that's a more complicated thing that probably deserves a little bit more time thinking about the most robust way to achieve that than if it, as you said, if the craft is aiming at glory, in which case, we can probably throw it out and the conflict with Stoicism is probably not worth thinking about that much.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it. Maybe instead of consequences, thinking about what's the target of this role, and then what are those constraints or bumpers, as you will, that say you're never going out of bounds in order to achieve the target, and being clear about those.
Cool, great, interesting.
Or at least as clear as you can.
Interesting discussion. I think I said that the hierarchy of roles doesn't really resolve the issue for the more complicated thought experiments, and I stand by that. But I do think functionally for normal people, for my day to day, the hierarchy of roles does do a lot of work. Like when I think of these conflicts in my own life, I go back to when I say, am I letting this role I've chosen for myself affect my relationships? Am I letting this role I've chosen affect my human goal of flourishing and happiness? And then I usually perform worse at it. I think if I look at my career or something, I say, well, I'm not going to become a bad person for the sake of professional success or something. And I do use that hierarchy and maintain it. I'm not as an important position as Machiavelli was talking about. Maybe I would be more, conflicted as an 18-year-old who had royalty thrust upon him or something. But for me, the hierarchies does do a lot of work. And I like this idea of subcomponents. The hierarchy is a good way of like not doing wrong, but then maybe it's like you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I like this idea of thinking, okay, well, if I pause for a bit and I think about why I'm attached to this rule, and I think about really what virtue really means, what justice really means, what courage really means, is there a way to achieve that rule that fits these things if I'm a bit more expansive about the view? That's probably pretty good for most conflicts for me.
Yeah, I think so. That's well put. I think perhaps we've left things in a little bit of a state of aporia or agnosticism for some of the more difficult cases we've gestured at. But in general, for most decisions, I do think thinking about the hierarchy, thinking about or clarifying the nature of a role in a common sense way is going to resolve most issues. Really, hope you all found this useful. I think it's the sort of thing that maybe we'll return to if y'all are interested, or if there are specific conflicts someone would like us to take a look at, or I come across, will probably worth rediving back into this issue. But cool, I enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome, thanks, Caleb.
Awesome, thanks for listening, all. Bye. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.